Hello, everyone. Welcome. We have a really exciting webinar today. I'm really excited about this, and especially the guest speaker that we have. Today's webinar, the 5 nutrition, fitness, and wellness topics you need to know for 2020, separating science from fiction. My name is Brian Sutton. I'm the content and production manager here at NASM. Been with the company since, about 15 years now. And I'm really excited for our guest speaker. His name is Brad Dieter. He's a chief scientific officer at, not Eat to Perform, now it's actually at Macros Inc. He's also the director of science at Harness Biotechnology. He is an exercise physiologist, a molecular biologist, and a biostatistician. A few things about Brad. He got his BA from Washington State, his MS and PhD from University of Idaho, and completed his postdoctoral fellowship in translational science at Providence Medical Research Center. So he's an expert in nutrition, physiology with specialties in metabolism and diabetic interventions. Actually, Brad's a great guy. You're gonna love his presentation today. Our agenda, we're gonna talk about vitamin D. We're gonna talk about genetics and chronic disease and nutrigenomics. And we're also going to talk about separating the hype from science. So I think you're really going to love today's webinar. We have a promotional giveaway at the very end, so be sure to stick around. And we will take all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So as you listen to the webinar today and you listen to Brad's presentation, if you have a question, type it in, and we will save your question for the end, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And our promotional giveaway is to save 35% on NASM's new nutrition coaching certification. So it's a really cool thing. I think you're all gonna love it. I'm most excited about hearing what Brad has to say. So let's kick it off. Brad, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Brian. Thank you guys so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back here in the virtual studio and looking forward to today's discussion.
Yeah, me too. You're a great guy, obviously a wealth of knowledge, and I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to you. Do your thing. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Is my screen showing up okay for everybody?
Yep, we got it.
Perfect. Yeah, so just a kind of a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about nutrigenomics, which is basically the topic of how does your genome really tell us about nutrition and what we should eat? Then we'll kind of tie that into a little bit more about disease and genetics because they kind of go hand in hand. And then we'll kind of go over, some of the commercially available genetic testing that can be done. And we have a sample report from one of the big companies that we'll kind of talk through a little bit so you guys can have an idea of if you do those type of tests, what they mean and how to interpret them. Then we'll talk a little bit about vitamin D supplementation, just because there's been a lot of really interesting research over the last decade. And we kind of really know a lot more now than we did when vitamin D became really popular. And then we'll talk a little bit about the recent Game Changers documentary that was on Netflix. And we'll kind of try to address it in a way of, how can we take what's important from that and how can we kind of fit that into what we know about the scientific evidence around kind of vegan and vegetarian diets. So we will go ahead and get started. So the first topic is nutrigenomics. And one of the things that I like to tell people who don't really have a really big background on exactly this type of topic and what it means is really the idea is how can our DNA tell us about what to eat? And a lot of us don't really have a good handle on what DNA does in our body and exactly how that kind of translates into our metabolism. So here's just kind of a graphic of, really how your body actually goes from DNA to metabolism or nutrition, so to speak, right? So we actually have our DNA, and then that makes what we call RNA, which is kind of the actual message that gets translated in your body from DNA. And then that RNA makes proteins, and then those proteins are what kind of run our metabolism, right? So there's actually several layers of what happens from DNA all the way through to metabolism. So it's not really quite as cut and dry as my DNA goes straight to how my body metabolizes food. There's several steps and processes along the way. And at each step, kind of the RNA and the protein and the metabolism level, there's different levels of regulation that occur that are completely independent of your DNA. And those things can be, how physically active are you? What is your dieting history? What's your micronutrient status? How lean or overweight are you? All those things can affect all the steps between DNA and metabolism. So it's not a very kind of clear cut straight from DNA to metabolism. There's a lot of things that kind of get in the way between those two steps. And the reason that's important is that kind of gives us an idea of, how much we know about our DNA and how does that exactly tell us what we should be consuming. So the other important aspect of kind of nutrigenomics is all of the technology that is currently available to us as people is based on what we call these single nucleotide polymorphisms, or basically, if you kind of go back to freshman or sophomore year of high school biology, and we know the DNA code is T, C's, A's, and G's, a lot of us have genes that are all the same except for maybe one letter, right? Maybe you have an A in one spot and maybe I have a G in one spot. Maybe you have a T in one spot and maybe I have a C in one spot. And those very small changes don't really change kind of what we look like or big changes about us as people. And they just have very, very minor effects, right? So some of the bigger single nucleotide polymorphisms that are tied into like nutrition are things like the enzymes that break down caffeine. So if you have an A instead of a T, you maybe metabolize caffeine a little bit faster than somebody who does have a T. So those are the types of things that we can learn. And so whenever you get a DNA test for nutrigenomics, they're not actually measuring your whole genome. They're just looking at specific genes and looking at, do you have one letter or another letter, and do you have two copies of one letter versus another? So that's primarily how those tests work. Now, one of the key pieces and things that we've actually learned from a lot of these studies is we've actually done research into looking at how do kind of dietary interventions in our genomes actually interact, right? So if we take a bunch of people and we actually measure their genome and we say, okay, it looks like maybe your genetics tell us you would do better on a low carbohydrate diet. Or maybe your genetics tell us that you would do better on a low fat diet. Or maybe you have the type of genome that doesn't really push you either way. So this graphic is just kind of a overview of a very large research study that was done a couple years ago where they actually did this exact intervention. So they took people and they genotyped them and they looked, and then they kind of categorized them into, did they have a low carb genotype, did they have a low fat genotype, or did they have neither genotype? And then they randomized them into either low fat or low carbohydrate diets. And they followed them for a year and looked at, basically, if we match a diet to what your genome tells us, are you more likely to lose weight than if you are kind of mismatched with your genotype? And so this is kind of the graph of the results, and I'll walk you guys through this very quickly. So at the top, basically what we see is if you look at people who are in the low fat genotype, and then people who are in the low carb genotype, and then neither, the big thing you notice is that it didn't really matter if we matched your diet to your genotype. Your weight loss was primarily the same regardless of what group you were in, right? So if you had a low fat genotype, you probably lost the same amount of weight if you consumed a low fat diet or if you consumed a low carbohydrate diet. The same thing was if you had a low carbohydrate genotype. If you consumed a low carbohydrate diet, you lost about the same amount of weight as if you consumed a low fat diet. And then people who had neither genotype also saw the same type of result. So even if we maybe have some markers that maybe tell us, how efficient your body is, or whether it's maybe primed to be a little bit more of utilizing carbohydrates or fats for fuel, in the real world applications, it doesn't really appear to have a big impact on your body's ability to lose weight or your body's ability to kind of metabolize food in general. So that's a little bit about what we know about nutrigenomics, and we'll come back and talk about some commercial testing here in a little bit. But I did want to talk very briefly about genetics and disease. So this kind of ties into the nutrition and genetics piece. And what we know is that there's kind of two different pieces to consider when we think about genetics and then how it relates to nutrition or disease. And it's really the interaction between how does genetics affect a disease and then how does an environment affect a disease. And they can fall on very different ends of the spectrum. So there are some diseases that are virtually entirely genetics dependent, right? So we know things that like cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy are almost entirely due to genetic mutations or things like that, right? So we know cystic fibrosis is a very specific mutation in the genome, and we know that muscular dystrophy is also a very specific mutation, that if you have it, you get the disease. On the other end of the spectrum, there are diseases that are basically have no genetic components at all, right? And those are things like scurvy, right? Which is if you don't get enough vitamin C, you get that disease. Another one would be like rickets, which is if you don't get enough vitamin D, doesn't matter what your genetics are, you're going to get rickets. And then also things like tuberculosis, which is an exposure to a bacteria, right? So there's things that are entirely environmental, and then there's things that are entirely genetic. And then in the middle, there's a lot of kind of what we know is modern chronic diseases. And that's things like heart disease, diabetes, and then even some things like ulcers have a little bit of a genetic component and a little bit of an environmental component. And so when we think about genetics in these pieces, is really it comes down to genetics can increase your risk for certain diseases, and then your environment can amplify those risks. So here's an example of what we think about in terms of genetics and obesity, right? So there's been a lot of discussion about, why do some people become obese and some people don't? And there's been a lot of exploration into the genetics of obesity. In this graph, I'll try to explain it a little bit, but all these little points are different genes, and the higher the point is on the graph, the more likely it's related to obesity. So we see, one gene at the very top, which we call the FTO gene, is probably the most associated with obesity. So that's probably the one that stands out the most in terms of, okay, this gene maybe tells us the most about obesity of all of our genes. Now, the interesting piece is if you look at the actual explanatory rate of a gene like this FTO gene, which is the most highly associative gene with obesity, is it really only explains about 5% of all of obesity, right? So what we know is if you take people who have this FTO gene, maybe about 5% of the obesity is explained by that, right? So if you have a population of 100 people who are obese, maybe only 2 of those people actually have that gene. So it tells us a little bit about obesity, but it doesn't tell us a lot about obesity. And then the other piece that I want to discuss really quickly is the idea of genetic risk. So let's say one of the most common genetic risk scores we can get with disease is for things like Alzheimer's, right? Which is the ApoE gene. And let's say you get a genetic test done, and it comes back, and you read this report that you have this gene, and it tells you have a 40% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. Now, immediately in your head, you're thinking, wow, a 50% increase, that means, I've got a much greater likelihood of developing Alzheimer's than somebody else. But really what that 40% means is it's 40% from whatever the baseline number is, right? So let's say just the average person without having that risky gene is 10%. So 40% increased risk on top of 10% is 14. So your overall risk is actually just 14 and not 10%. So understanding genetic risk can get very, very difficult if you don't really kind of have an idea of what the underlying rates of a disease are, right? So if you see you have a 30% increased risk of a certain type of cancer, but only 0.1% of the population does get that cancer, it's not like you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting it. It means you have a 0.13% of getting it. So really kind of understanding that a lot of the commercial tests that we get don't really do a good job of explaining your overall risk. They just kind of give you a relative risk increase. And that if you do ever get a genetic test done, speaking with somebody who's like a genetic counselor is much better at interpreting those than kind of the average layperson. So let's go to genetic testing. So like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the commercially available tests that people do are based on these, we call them single nucleotide polymorphisms. So basically what happens when you do one of these commercial tests, whether they take a blood sample or they do a saliva swab where they send you a kit and you swab it at home and you put it in a little capsule and you send it in. What they're doing is they have things that measure very specific genes that they're looking at, and they measure very specific changes in these base pairs. And what these do is they try to give you some idea of what your genotype is. So here's an example of one from a commercially available test. So this was actually from a personal client of mine that I've worked with for years. He got this done and he sent it to me, and he told me that we could share this. So this is an actual report. So this is an example of maybe what a report might give you about your carbohydrate metabolism. So on the left here, it's kind of a picture of a chromosome, and it kind of lists the different genes that they measured. So you've got this MMAB, this IRS1, this FTO, and then it kind of gives you a breakdown of what your body maybe looks like. So this one, it gives you a recommendation of, hey, you probably need, a higher carbohydrate intake for improved weight loss. That's what this one's telling you. But if we compare that to what more rigorous studies have done, that doesn't really translate into actual weight loss in the real world. So they're telling you something that isn't really overly supported by the literature. But they provide a recommendation that you consume 50 to 65% of your daily calories from carbohydrates. The next one basically indicates that you should consume more fiber, and then the last one for carbohydrates recommends that you should probably consume low sugar intake. Now the interesting piece about these recommendations is these all fall in line with the recommendations mostly for the entire population of people, right? Having a moderate carbohydrate intake, consuming a high fiber diet, and keeping your sugar low. So this isn't really telling you anything that's overly earth-shattering or overly informative. It's just kind of giving you baseline recommendations. And we kind of see the same things if you do like a genotype screen on fat intake, right? These recommend moderate total fats, so 20 to 35% of your daily calories from fat. That's what the kind of USDA recommendations are. Tells you to keep saturated fat low, also falls in line with standard recommendations. Consuming a high amount of omega-3s, also just kind of within regular guidelines, and then to moderate polyunsaturated fat intake. So when you actually look through most of these types of things, the recommendations around like protein, carbohydrate, and fat intake don't really tell us anything above what we just know from normal nutrition research, right? These genetic tests don't really tell us anything above and beyond what we know. Now, where some of these commercial tests actually do have some merit is when we get into some of the micronutrient metabolism pieces. And the reason that this is where we can actually see a little more information, is that the way your body metabolizes the macronutrients is a little bit different than the way your body will metabolize and utilize vitamins and minerals. And a lot of this has to come down to just how much simpler vitamin and mineral metabolism is versus macronutrient metabolism, and how much your kind of ethnic background can determine what your needs are. So for example, vitamin D, right? We do know that there is a big genetic component to actual vitamin D levels. So we know that skin color makes a big difference in vitamin D just because of the way vitamin D is metabolized based on sunlight. So this person, they have a genetic variant that's linked to lower vitamin D levels. And indeed, this is a client who actually kind of has chronic low levels of vitamin D and requires supplementation to maintain them. So he lives in a part of the world that doesn't get a lot of sun, and he has a genetic predisposition. So that's something where genetic testing may be helpful. The other side of that coin is if you do get your vitamin D levels tested and it's low, you're going to have the same intervention as if you have a genetic screen and then go get it tested anyway. So it won't tell you anything more in a practical perspective than what like a routine blood panel would tell you. And then other things like, vitamin E and things like folate are also things that you can actually learn a little bit from genetic testing, right? You can maybe see, what are my genetic predispositions to some of these things. So folate is one of those things that does have a genetic component and how it's metabolized. So the last piece is another aspect of genetic testing that may actually be helpful. So macronutrient recommendations based on nutrigenomics are not very helpful at all for almost anybody. There may be some benefit to micronutrient nutrigenomics, but food sensitivities and substances in terms of metabolism is an area where you can actually gain some insight into nutrigenomics, right? That you can actually get a little bit better information than you can from elsewhere. So here's an example where they have a genotype that is associated with basically lactose intolerance. And indeed, this is a client of mine who is lactose intolerant. So his genetic score matches up with his actual, like what we see in the real world. And then we also know that things like gluten sensitivity or other food sensitivities or food allergies can have a genetic component. And he has a higher likelihood of being sensitive to gluten. So there are some things you can learn from food sensitivities based on some of these genomic screens. Now, they're not perfect, right? You can have a high lactose sensitivity and have no problem with milk, and you can have a low lactose sensitivity and you can have a problem with milk. So these aren't perfect, but they can kind of point you in the right direction in terms of starting to do some clinical testing. And then the last piece for some of these is things like caffeine, alcohol, and then other things like some prescription drugs. Your body has specific enzymes that break those down, and genetic variants in those can affect, whether you're a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. So this person, they have the fast ability to clear caffeine from your system. So the way their body processes caffeine is much quicker than somebody else. And that we can actually learn from a genetic test. And then alcohol is another one, and then things like some prescription drugs or like anesthesia, you can actually learn some things from some of these nutrigenomic type tests. So the next one we'll cover really quickly is vitamin D. So we talked a little bit about vitamin D metabolism, but I'll cover this in a little more detail here. So there's been a lot of interest and scientific inquiry on vitamin D over the last, since probably the late 90s, early 2000s. And the reason being is, of all of the nutrients we have in our body, we're most likely to be deficient in vitamin D. And here's kind of the percent of people who are either at risk for inadequacy, so they're not kind of at optimal levels, and then at risk for deficiency. So if we look at the entire population, right? So roughly about 30 to 35% of the entire population in the United States is at risk for either inadequacy or deficiency, and between 6 to 10%, depending on if you're male or female, are at risk for an overt deficiency. And then if we look at non-Hispanic whites and blacks, we also see a big discrepancy here, right? So we do see that there is a kind of genetic predisposition to having a much higher likelihood of being vitamin D deficient. And this has to do with the fact that people who have more melanin in their skin don't get as much sunlight just to the lower levels of their skin where vitamin D is produced from cholesterol. So they actually have lower levels. So they either need more sunlight, so they need to live in a place where they get more sunlight, or they have to consume more in their diet. And generally speaking, we don't get a lot of vitamin D in our diet. One of the highest sources is mushrooms, and then we have fortified milk, and things like fresh fish have vitamin D in them. But we don't get a lot of those in our diet. So most people end up being, having vitamin D inadequacies or deficiencies. So why is this important? One of the things that we've learned over the last probably 10 to 15 years of scientific work is that if you are deficient in vitamin D, a lot of bad things can happen. And if you correct those deficiencies, you can prevent a lot of those bad things. So one of the more interesting pieces is that if you're an athlete and you have low levels of vitamin D, you may have impaired performance. And if you supplement with vitamin D and correct that deficiency, you can actually improve your athletic performance. Now, if you take vitamin D above and beyond correcting a deficiency, it doesn't do anything. But if you correct your deficiency, you can kind of prevent any of those performance reductions. There's also very clear evidence that if you're vitamin D deficient, you're more likely to get an upper respiratory tract infection, right? So things like, a cold or a flu, right? So we've got a big influenza scare right now is, making sure you're correcting a vitamin D deficiency actually can reduce your risk of developing some of these upper respiratory tract infections. Fractures. So if you correct a vitamin D deficiency, you're less likely to have bone breaks. It can improve immune function. And one of the interesting pieces is we don't have precise doses of how much vitamin D people should take per day, because it really depends on how deficient they are. And then it also depends a little bit on their, racial, ethnic, genetic background. But roughly 2,000 to 5,000 IUs per day are kind of the guidelines for correcting deficiencies. Okay, so we'll move on a little bit to a discussion kind of around vegan and vegetarian diets. And this stems from, there's been a lot of questions about these type of diets based on this recent documentary, The Game Changers. So we're not gonna go into all of the nuances of the documentary itself, but I do wanna cover some of the main concepts to consider with some of these vegan or vegetarian approaches. So here's what we know about vegan diets, and we're going to cover some of the pros and some of the cons. These diets can be very effective for weight loss, right? There's a lot of scientific literature to support their use for weight loss. They, even going back to probably 30 or 40 years ago, these studies have been done looking at vegan, vegetarian diets, and they can be very effective for weight loss. Now, there's some caveats there. If you take people and you put them on a vegan or vegetarian diet compared to another kind of calorie-controlled diet, there's no additional weight loss benefit from having, a vegan or vegetarian approach versus another approach. So they can be very effective for weight loss, but they're not more effective than other approaches when we control for calories. And that work's been done several times in very large groups of people. And we know that what makes the difference there is how adherent to the diet they are, right? So if you have somebody who you're deciding whether they need, if you have somebody that you're deciding what diet to use and they have a lot of weight to lose, if they are going to be more adherent with a vegan diet than they are with a non-vegan diet just because of their preferences, they will probably lose more weight because they're more adherent to the vegan diet. So those are things to consider there. Another benefit of vegan diets is they can be very nutrient dense diets, right? So if you structure a vegan and or vegetarian approach to eating such that you're eating a lot of fruits, vegetables, and some of those really nutrient dense foods, you can actually have a very nutrient dense diet. One of the caveats to that is that you may end up with some nutrient deficiencies because there's certain nutrients that plants either don't make or they're not as available to the human body as they are from animal foods. And so the big three things that you need to consider if you are consuming a vegan or vegetarian diet is vitamin B12. So plants do not make vitamin B12. It's strictly a animal-based vitamin. And so if you are a vegan, you probably need to be supplementing with vitamin B12. Another one is choline. Choline is a molecule it's not a vitamin or mineral, but it's kind of a vitamin mineral-like protein. It's more vitamin-like than anything. But plants also cannot make choline. They just don't have the machinery to make it. So you have to consume it in supplemental form. And then the last one is iron, right? Plants do contain iron. They can make iron. They use it for a lot of their metabolic processes. But the way it's bound up in a plant makes it harder for humans to digest it. So if you were to have a gram of iron from a plant and a gram of iron from animal source, you're going to absorb more of the iron in a more useful form from the animal than you are from the plant. So those are things to consider. To kind of address some of the concepts that were put forth in that documentary is vegan or vegetarian diets don't appear to be the only or optimal way to live, right? So when we look at what it requires to have optimal human health, there's aspects of vegan diets that don't really promote that, right? We do know that some of these nutrient deficiencies are things that can kind of reduce optimal health. Unless you're very careful with how you structure it, you usually will end up with some amino acid deficiencies, and that kind of reduces optimal health. There's other aspects in terms of how you structure your vegan diet that may also kind of reduce some of the health aspects of it. So it's not the optimal way to live, but it is one way you can actually construct your diet and still have some healthy aspects of it. And that means that there's trade-offs to using fully vegan approaches, right? One of the things we do know is that having diets that are very plant heavy is a really good way to have a very healthful approach to eating. But if you eschew all animal proteins, there's trade-offs. There's nutrient deficiencies. Sometimes there's protein deficiencies, and there's things like that to consider. And then one of the really key aspects is whenever you view any sort of diet in general, whether it is a vegan and or vegetarian approach, is understanding the core principles that make it beneficial are much more important than understanding the exact specific dietary schema. So some of the core principles about vegan diets that you can take away that are very beneficial is they tend to promote more plant-based diets, right? So getting more fruits and vegetables in your diet. Those are excellent principles to take away from a vegan or vegetarian approach. Another one that you can take away from it is being more conscious about the food sources that you're consuming, right? So if you're choosing to adopt the vegan diet because of how we practice current animal husbandry, there's some very important things you can take away from that. If adopting a vegan or vegetarian diet, one of the core principles is just being more conscious and aware of the food choices you're making and opting for things that are more nutrient dense. Those are also very good kind of core principles to take away from it. And then another one would be, do vegan diets cause you to consume fewer calories for weight loss? They can absolutely do that. So that's another core principle to take away from it than the exact dietary schema. One of the other claims that's made in that movie is a little bit about how humans maybe have evolved to consume vegan or vegetarian diets. And if you look at the evolutionary biology of both humans, mammals in general, and look at herbivores versus omnivores, there's some key things that we can look at that kind of indicate that humans did not, in fact, evolve to consume specifically vegan diets, right? So the first is we end up with nutrient deficiencies if we consume an entire, plant-based diet, right? That kind of tells us something. If we can't manufacture enough of a nutrient from our own body, we have to get it from eating animal sources. That probably means we weren't evolved to eat solely plant-based. Other things that we look at are like digestive tracts. How do our digestive tracts compare to herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, right? We're very much designed anatomically from an evolutionary perspective more like omnivores than we are herbivores, and we look more like carnivores than we do like herbivores. Same thing with like dental structure, right? So there's those pieces that we also know. So really kind of the summary about that is there's definitely benefits to vegan diets. There's good principles you can take away from it. Learning the value of having a very plant heavy diet or things that you can take into your kind of your nutrition sphere, and you can use that. But it's not the optimal way to live, especially when we get to special populations like athletes, and it's not what needs to be used for all populations all the time. So I think that's all that we have today, and we can take any questions.
Okay. Brad, first of all, thank you very much for everything. That was a really informative presentation, talking about all the different factors regarding nutrition and genetics, and then of course talking about vegan diets. We do have some questions I want to address, and we're just gonna hit this and start going. So the first one is pros and cons of at-home versus medical doctor. For example, is the blood test that you get with genetic testing, what's more accurate, going to the doctor and getting a blood test, or some of those at-home type of kits?
So generally they're pretty similar. So if you go into a physician's office and they do a blood test, they're going to be using the same technology to measure the DNA, right? Some companies are a little bit better than others in terms of their technology, but it kind of all ends up in the same type of analysis. Where it's more helpful is when you, like if you go into a doctor's office and they help you interpret the data, that's more important than like exactly which technology is being used.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So just keep that in mind, everyone. Our second question is talking about micronutrient absorption. So do we absorb more from plants versus animal sources? So vitamins and minerals, how do we absorb them from a plant source versus an animal source?
Yeah, so it's, there's not like a perfect answer, but if we, in general, animal-based minerals are more readily absorbed than plant-based minerals on average. So things like iron, magnesium, zinc, calcium, those sorts of things, we tend to absorb more easily from animals than we do from plants. And that just has to do with the way that they're structured molecularly in a plant versus in an animal. Your body's just, it's easier for it to absorb it. In general, vitamins kind of follow the same path, right? So if we think about, especially the fat-soluble vitamins, so things like vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin A, and vitamin E, they are fat-soluble, which means that you have to have, you absorb them more readily when you have dietary fat present with the vitamins. And in animals, most of your fat soluble vitamins are stored in fat. So when you consume them, they're together and they get absorbed more readily. When you have them in plants, typically they absorb better if you consume additional fat with that meal than if you're just consuming them by themselves.
Okay, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. So it really just depends on the food source on how well a vitamin or a mineral can get absorbed into our own body.
Yes.
Yeah. Next questions. Suggestions for how to best supplement micronutrients if you are deficient. So is a pill versus a chewable versus an IV? What's optimal for someone if they know they are deficient in a certain vitamin or mineral?
Yeah, so the first step is whenever we have people with vitamin deficiencies is have a blood test done so you can see how deficient you are. Work with a physician to figure out what the dosage is. And then from there, it really depends on each nutrient. So we know, things like if you're vitamin B12 deficient, like a daily oral is totally fine. If you're iron deficient, if you're severely iron deficient, you maybe need IV therapy. If you're moderately deficient, an oral daily tablet will work. If you're vitamin D deficient, an oral daily chewable is totally fine. So it really depends on each one. There's really no this is the specific answer, but for most of them, except for extreme cases, it kind of over-the-counter chewable or just pill form usually does the job.
Yeah, great points. And one of the things I wanted to add to that, if anyone here is working as a nutrition coach or a personal trainer and their clients are saying they are deficient in a certain nutrient, it's usually best to stay within scope and have them talk to a physician or a registered dietitian to really provide them a plan of attack for that specific deficiency, rather than prescribe a certain supplement to clients for that deficiency.
Yep.
Next one is is nutrition genetic testing even recommended if there's no apparent benefit? So I guess if someone's apparently healthy, would they gain any sort of benefit from doing some of this nutrition genetic testing?
For most people, there's really no real benefit to it. So if I have maybe out of the 10,000 clients at this point in my career I've either coached or overseen, there's maybe been one or two people that we've had genetic testing we've asked them to do. But for most people, there's really no additional information that you would learn that would change how you would coach somebody, how you would, make suggestions. There's just not a lot of additional actionable information.
That brings me up a caveat on this. I know even now there's genetic testing that can help prescribe exercise or physical activity. What are your thoughts on genetic testing to determine best forms of physical activity or exercise?
It kind of falls in the same camp. There's really no additional benefit for people, right? What the genetics for exercise testing will, if anything, it will maybe just tell you what your body's naturally going to be good at, right? So it might tell you have more type 2 muscle fibers. So you'd probably be better as a power lifter than you would as a marathon runner. So that's about kind of the extent that it tells you. But the rest of it doesn't really tell you anything important about exercise, right? We know that depending on the intensity and the volume and the modality, your body's going to adapt to the training, and your genetics, what you know about your genetics doesn't really change how that happens.
Yeah, and this is a great point because I have found, training with clients over the years, getting the basics down first, probably that's 99% of the equation before we ever get into these advanced forms of assessment, right? But getting someone to actually have and adopt healthy habits, like improving their diet and just exercising the minimum amount of time per day per week for health, maybe we should start focusing on some of those things before we get into some of the nitty gritty, unless we're working with a, maybe it's an absolute elite athlete.
Yeah.
Last question, or actually we have a few more, but here's a really good one, because you mentioned vitamin D. Can you supplement too much vitamin D?
So you can. We do know that vitamin D toxicity, so to speak, is a thing. It's hard to do. So if you're taking, kind of the normal recommended 2,000 to 5,000 IUs a day, your likelihood of it being a problem is very low. Now, if you're taking, 100,000 units a day, you're probably going a little overboard. But it's really hard to kind of really overdo it. But definitely, that's why having like once a year blood work done is a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. And we can all work that into just seeing our primary care physician, right? Once a year, do that
Yep.
annual wellness check, and we can determine, are we anemic and need more iron, if we need more vitamin D, and we could always address that. But that's a great point. I have a really cool one here. Any benefit to eating for body type? So if you're an endomorph versus an ectomorph or a mesomorph, is there any benefit for eating for that specific body type?
So the kind of scientific evidence doesn't really support that idea. Generally speaking, what we know about body types doesn't really tell us anything about how effective a certain type of dietary intervention is, right? So there's no like, hey, if you're an endomorph, you should do this. If you're an ectomorph, you should do this. Outside of kind of the fundamental nutrition principles of energy balance, macronutrient distribution, and micronutrient distribution, there's really nothing else that we can learn from somebody's, somatotype. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it really just goes back to what is their daily life like, right? So how physically active are they? What sort of foods are they eating? Maybe that's where we can gain some of that information from the client intake process and make it more individualized based on that person and their behaviors versus just their somatotype, and you're an ectomorph, so you have to eat this certain way. Now, that
Yeah,
makes sense.
exactly.
I have a question here. I think I know the answer. What nutrition cert do you recommend?
The CNC by NASM.
I appreciate that. Just for all of those who are viewing today, Brad was our lead subject matter expert on the CNC. So he was the lead peer reviewer. So we had 20 different authors. Gosh, I don't know how many of them, like there are PhDs and registered dietitians that helped create the curriculum for the CNC. And Brad was our lead peer reviewer. So every single chapter was written by an expert, either PhD or registered dietitian, and then reviewed by another expert, and then peer reviewed again by Brad. So it went through a lot of revisions and a lot of peer review to make sure that it was all evidence-based. So thanks for the promo, Brad. I appreciate it. You were instrumental in the CNC, and we couldn't have done it without you. One thing I would like to point out as we were talking through everything is there's a lot of information out there on what's the best way to eat. And if there's any sort of discrepancies regarding chronic disease, or there's any concerns regarding chronic disease, eating disorders, make sure that the individual goes sees a registered dietitian or a physician. It's out of scope of practice for personal trainers and nutrition coaches to provide nutritional therapy or to create meal plans that are specific to chronic disease. So with that said, Brad, again, thank you for everything. This was a really good presentation. One more announcement. We have our CNC winner. It's Kristen Jolly. So Kristen, congratulations for the CNC. You're going to get the CNC. We will be contacting you, so there's no need to do anything. I hope you really enjoyed the curriculum. I think you're really going to enjoy it, though. And then again, if you want to save 35% on NASM's nutrition coaching certification, use the code webinar17, and that's phone only. So make sure you call the number you see here at the bottom of the screen, 888-773-1827. Brad, again, it was a pleasure. I hope we get to do this again. Thank you so much for all the information you provided today.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to talking with you guys again.
All right. Thanks, Brad. And thanks, everyone.
Take care.